If you want to get a sense of how massive the federal investigation into January 6th is, here's something to keep in mind. The FBI, they are still arresting rioters more than 2 years later. These are people they've known about for months. People like Daniel and Peyton Valdez, who just got charged in the last few days. Daniel's Peyton's dad. They traveled to D.C. from Colorado. Daniel took pictures of his son inside the Capitol. In one snapshot, Peyton is holding up a riot shield that's been dropped on the floor. He's cracked open a beer. There's even this one video of Peyton online telling the camera, the next time we come back, it ain't gonna be effing unarmed. That's for goddamn sure. Afterwards, he texted a few friends. And it looks like they said, oh, looks like we're gonna be arrested.
Yes. There's a lot of comments like that. Yep, and then you eventually will. But that's the weird thing where I think a lot of people probably, it must be really unsettling if you went into the Capitol and you don't know when this knock on your door is going to come.
If it surprises you that the FBI is still hauling people like this in front of judges years later, Ryan Reilly, who's a justice reporter over at NBC News, he says it really shouldn't. How often are they tracking people down still now?
Still very regularly. They're only really a third through the number of people who totally could be arrested. So, yeah, I mean, they're definitely still coming in. But based on the current trajectory, they're never going to get to everybody who they could arrest, even though.
Never,
no.
Even though, they know their identities and everything.
They have more than 1,000 identities of people who haven't been arrested yet.
Even more fascinating to Ryan is how a whole lot of these suspects got identified in the first place. Of the people who are identifiable who were at the Capitol on January 6th, how many of them have been identified by online sleuths?
Hundreds.
These online sleuths, they call themselves Sedition hunters. And Ryan says they've been the driving force behind the federal investigation into the Capitol riot. So today on the show, we'll go inside their world. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. You are listening while you're driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's really easy, and you can save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average. And auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year. So you're protected, no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
When the Supreme Court decided to end the constitutional right to an abortion, they stole people's freedoms and stripped them of their ability to control their own bodies. But this movement won't be defeated. All across the country, every time abortion rights are put directly to the people through ballot initiatives in states like Kansas, California, Michigan, Vermont, and Montana, supporters have fought back and won, protected, or expanded access to abortion. That's because the right to an abortion is the majority opinion. Did you know that 85% of Americans believe abortion should be legal? 85%. Planned Parenthood knows that healthcare equity, including access to safe, legal abortion, is a human right. They'll fight with everything they've got to protect that right, but they need your help. To join the movement, donate to Planned Parenthood today and visit plannedparenthood.org/future.
So, Ryan, where were you on January 6th? How were you watching what played out?
I was at home, like a lot of people. I think I would have probably been there had it not been for the pandemic, but it was something I was reporting on the Proud Boys in the lead up to, because Enrique Tarrio had been arrested the prior day. And we were all sort of aware that a bunch of people who believed a crazy conspiracy theory were coming to D.C.
I remember that day just sitting there watching TV, kind of bowled over by everything I was able to witness myself, even though I wasn't there. I'm kind of curious if you had the same moment. Like, I was just like, this is crazy. I'm watching people scale the Capitol.
Yeah, and I did. And there was also a huge divide, I think, between what we were seeing online and what we were seeing on our television screens.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, in terms of the cable news coverage, what you had was often these sort of distant images, right? Because there was not a lot of coverage of the west side of the Capitol, which is where most of the violence took place. Most of the cameras were on the east side of the Capitol. And so we saw these images come through, and even looking back at the coverage of it that day, and it's often like, oh, there are some people on the stairs. This is kind of crazy. But we really didn't have that view of just this violent mob that was assaulting law enforcement officers on the west side of the Capitol. Stack up what was on television with what was happening on the internet. And I think that divide sort of became clear because even, the FBI wasn't even aware of what was happening. You weren't in the middle of the action in a way that a lot of these videos that we saw online and live streams were.
As these raw images came out, what struck you? And I wonder, when did you begin to think, these images could be used to identify these people?
Early on, I think there were a lot of people who went very viral, sort of the low-hanging fruit of this investigation who were arrested very quickly, sort of the
people who looked silly or were very violent.
Correct. Exactly. We saw that with QAnon Shaman, obviously, was arrested within days. Big O, the guy who put his feet on Nancy Pelosi's desk, also same sort of situation, arrested very quickly. And because it had so much media attention, these were, people who knew them were identifying them and sending them into the FBI, or they were just openly bragging about it under their own names online. And it wasn't that difficult to find them. And I think what happened very quickly is some of the open source researchers who have been through this in previous iterations recognize the importance of scouring and collecting that information pretty quickly.
How did you first see people online begin to gather images and then sort of methodically figure out who someone was?
So the way I sort of came into this was because there was this video of this woman known as Bullhorn Lady. She was actually just sentenced last week, spoiler alert, to more than 4 years in federal prison. But this was this woman named Rachel Powell. And I sort of made a joke tweet because it reminded me of the voice that she was using as she was on this bullhorn and instructing members of the mob how they could take the building. She said,
"There's also 2 doors in the other room. One at the rear and one to the right when you go in. So people should probably coordinate together if you're going to take this building."
It sort of reminded me almost as like that, frustrated tone that you have with your kids, and almost like she was chaperoning the insurrection.
Like she was a PTA mom.
I actually made that exact joke. I said, $20 says that this results not only in criminal charges, but also in a PTA resignation. And shortly thereafter, someone landed in my inbox and said, "Hey, Ryan, we've identified this person. We're trying to figure out what to do with it." Ultimately, I got a little bit scooped there because the New Yorker and Ronan Farrow ended up writing that story. But I sort of put my journalistic jealousy aside and stuck with it and got the next one that they had identified and were having trouble getting any action on. And that was a much more serious crime. It was the individual who drove a stun gun into Officer Mike Fanone's neck on January 6th. And this was someone who was at a bunch of Trump rallies in California. And so ultimately, it was a month after we broke the story revealing his name that he had his back door busted down by the FBI. And he's been in federal custody ever since and was recently sentenced to 12 and a half years in federal prison.
Those first tips Ryan got came from a guy named Forrest Rogers, who's still one of the only sleuths who's gone public with his real name. But Ryan soon realized that Forrest was part of a growing network of investigators. This group took pains to conceal their identities, so they wouldn't meet up in Zoom calls, for instance. That could make their IP addresses and other information way too public. Instead, they kept in touch on encrypted apps, getting to know each other exclusively from anonymized usernames and cartoon avatars.
As this went on, what's been interesting about it is there are still a lot of these sleuths who I do not know their real identity. But what I do know is I know their track records.
Really? Even after years of reporting on them?
There are some people who I've met in person who I do not know their real names. One of them has met my wife, who I don't actually know their real name. But what I do know is their investigative track record.
What a strange deep throat situation.
It is very strange. But what's interesting for me, and I think for the Bureau, is that they can vet all of this on their own. You don't necessarily have to just completely put yourself in someone else's hands because
they come with receipts.
They come with receipts, precisely. Yeah. So over the years, I've gotten to know these people, and they're people that I really, really trust.
Did they know each other before January 6th? And January 6th just sort of kicked people into gear? Or did January 6th bring people together?
Oh, no, not at all. That brought everyone together. Yeah, these are people from all across the country who never knew each other, but now, some of them were best friends, right? And send each other Christmas cards.
It's one thing to form an online community, but actually performing this investigative digital forensic work, making positive identifications from hours and hours of footage, these sleuths needed tools. So one guy actually created an app that combed through hours of archived footage to find fleeting, unguarded moments when suspects were especially identifiable. It leveraged a technology that is snuck into the background of everyday life.
Facial recognition. So you can get part of it, and that connects them with another person in this sort of database that they have all together of all these videos. So you might have only a partial face shot, but that'll connect them with that other part of their face. So, if you have someone with sunglasses, it will connect them to someone without sunglasses who's the same person, right? So you can get them at various points. I think a good example I could talk about the Logan Barnhart case. Essentially what happened is you had an individual who dragged a cop down the stairs, but he had sunglasses on. His face was often covered. And then he also, threw a pole later. He was involved in some of the real violence of January 6th. But he was always covered up and you couldn't quite get a good face shot. Then when they ran that facial recognition check, it pulls up all of these romance novel covers. It turns out this guy was a bodybuilder. And so that from there, they then went on his Instagram profile, found him wearing the same sweatshirt. He was, recorded a video of himself in the gym punching a punching bag. And also he had posted about January 6th saying, you guys don't know what really happened. And I think he was sort of mocking the FBI. They identified him that way, sent that into the FBI. And then when I ended up talking to the FBI, they had an arrest sort of going in place.
It just makes you realize how public we all are now, even if we don't think we are.
Yes, but they don't just send in these things after getting a facial recognition match. Even though facial recognition is improving and getting better, they really do find some other confirming material that they can use to make sure that the people that they are saying is a person is actually the person.
Online sleuthing has this mixed history. Back with the Boston Marathon bombing, crowdsourced investigations eventually led to a man being wrongly accused. What do you think made this investigation different?
I think they learned a lot of the lessons of the Boston Marathon bombing. And very quickly, when you had people throwing out IDs, they would very quickly get replies. They would get direct messages about not doing that. And the rules were pretty well established and spread from the early days. We do not name people online. So while there may sort of be these independent people, freelance, they were pretty quickly rejected, I think, from the overall sedition hunters community if they went about naming people.
Were there any IDs that went wrong? How did the sleuths handle that?
Very early on, I think when people who weren't actually involved with the effort or were sort of pushed out of the effort might have wrongly identified people. I remember I've got a few random tips that were not correct. There was someone who was featured on the FBI's list that someone thought was this mayor from California or something, and they vaguely looked the same. I can see why someone thought that, but all I had to do was go back and say, oh, no, there was a council meeting or something that day that he was there for. So I was able to vet that pretty easily. But
it sounds like you kind of became a sleuth, too.
In the early days, I mean, there was a lot of interest in who these people were, and it was clear the FBI was overwhelmed. And I think that that's really when the sleuths ended up turning more to reporters and to the media because they were not getting anywhere. And the feedback loop was really concerning because the FBI has these pretty stringent, strict rules about talking about ongoing investigations. And that has been a source of frustration for the sleuths because they can't find out updates in these cases. They'll be like, I sent this to you 2 years ago. What the hell has been happening? Where's this? Where does this stand? Where is this at?
After the break, this frustration with the FBI, it turns out it was indicative of a much deeper, more bureaucratic problem.
Maybe you've heard that there's a civil war coming.
Tyrants disarm the people they intend to oppress.
That with more than 100 gun deaths a day in America, the powers that be are going to have to do something.
They don't like the Second Amendment. They want to get rid of the Second Amendment.
You've heard that the government has always hated an armed populace.
All they want to do is take guns away from law-abiding citizens.
But in my 8 years of gun reporting, the game is rigged. My name is Alon Stevens, and I'm an investigative reporter. What if I told you that when it comes to the U.S. government, we're the biggest gun dealers on the block? That the halls of American power know exactly what I know. That guns aren't just who we are. They're what we do best.
Guns are flying off the shelves. Ghost gun mill in Dorchester.
Drop the gun! Drop the gun!
This is The Gun Machine, how America is forged by the gun industry. A new podcast from WBUR and The Trace. Search and follow The Gun Machine in your podcast app.
Hey, What Next, listener? I've got a special message for all of you out in Canada. It's been a show I think you should listen to, Canadaland. Every week, Canadaland's journalists bring you news and conversations that honestly can be hard to find these days. With rigorous reporting and thoughtful analysis, their episodes bring you into the most important conversations from across the country being Canada. From a radical form of reconciliation emerging in Saskatchewan to an in-depth debate about gun rights and the rise of fascism, Canadaland stories will surprise you, make you think. Try Canadaland today and find out why Canadian news doesn't have to sound like Canadian news. By the way, a Canadian wrote that for me to read. Search Canadaland in your podcast app. Hey, this is Mary Harris, host of Slate's daily news podcast, What Next? Slate's mission has always been to cut through the noise, boldly and provocatively. This election season and Supreme Court term are no different. Important coverage like this, though, it would not be possible without the support of our Slate Plus members. So, I'm going to invite you to join us with a special offer. You can try your first 3 months for only $15. That is $5 a month for your first 3 months of uninterrupted ad-free listening on every Slate podcast, member-exclusive episodes and segments of your favorite shows like Amicus and the Political Gabfest, and unlimited reading on the Slate site. Best of all, you'll be supporting all of Slate's independent journalism and analysis as we make sense of the news like no one else can. Sign up for Slate Plus at slate.com/podcastsplus. Again, that is 3 months for only $15. So sign up now at slate.com/podcastplus. One thing that stands out from your reporting is just how much faster this big group of random, untrained people were able to investigate what happened on January 6th compared to the federal government. I wonder if we can just talk about that a bit. Like, one of the things you make a point of in your book is to say that, like, the FBI was founded at the turn of the century in 1908. Same year the Model T came out, so more people have cars, more people can do all sorts of interstate crimes because they can get there. So there's a need for a federal Bureau of Investigation. It seems like we're at a similar technological turning point now with the internet, but it doesn't seem like the FBI is turning.
They're not. And I mean, it's tough to turn a huge ship like the FBI. It has its ways that they've been doing for decades, generations, and it's very difficult to get them to pivot And I think if you just think about the people who join the FBI and the people that you really need to work at the FBI in terms of the technological resources, this becomes sort of crystal clear. Because if you're really technologically skilled and you spent, a good amount of money on a degree, and then you're looking at your options, and okay, it's on the one hand, I could give up pot for a year before I apply, and I could basically set a limit on where I could ever get financially in terms of salary. The FBI doesn't have really cool campuses in cities where people want to live. If you're a special agent, they could dispatch you anywhere in the country, and they don't really care what your spouse's career is. So it's not particularly appealing to young people who are technologically skilled to join an organization like the FBI and then deal with all of these sort of bureaucratic hurdles that you see them really dealing with.
One thing I don't get from your reporting, like you talk about how the people working together, they created an app, they found ways to plug video into things. I mean, why can't the FBI just download the app? Like, what? I don't understand why they're so stuck.
I think there are some concerns there, especially with the FBI just grabbing things online or anything in public. There are some First Amendment concerns. The FBI shouldn't just be grabbing anything on a protest. And that's how some of these IDs come about. Often there's some sort of separate event. A lot of the Stop the Steal rallies were huge for the sleuths, because you'll have an instance where someone shows up to the Capitol and then you get a facial recognition match with a photo of them in, say, Harrisburg. I say Harrisburg because that's where a lot of individuals were gathered who ended up storming the Capitol at one of these Stop the Steal protests. In fact, one of them was standing behind Jim Jordan and then went on to, while in military gear, tell other rioters to steal cops' guns and pepper spray a line of officers.
So you're saying the problem is that it looks like political persecution.
Right. And I think they're super sensitive to that, especially when you have all these members of Congress who are really turning up the heat, I think, on the FBI.
I mean, that's a real problem, given that there is one political party in this country that is encouraging political violence.
It is. It's concerning. And I think that they're all sort of watching where this goes. But, you can only placate so much. And I think that that's the real situation. The crystallizing moment for me was when there's this FBI individual at the Washington field office who was being interviewed about what was happening in the lead up to January 6th. And she sort of begrudgingly said that, yes, rhetoric was getting more heated as it got closer to January 6th. And then there's a pause and they sort of ask the next question. And she says, on both sides. And that was just like a gobsmacking moment for me, because it's like, what are you talking about? There were not Joe Biden supporters plotting to storm the Capitol to overthrow the election that he won. It fundamentally doesn't compute.
But they felt that pressure.
It was almost like this instinctual thing that was built into them because we don't want to look politically biased. And you just have to talk real and be like, the right wing threat has been so clear for so long. And I think that that's what the fundamental disconnect is here.
When did it become clear to the FBI that with the January 6th case, they would need to accept outside help from these internet sleuths?
I mean, it's sort of, I think, morphed in the first year, because early on, it was mostly people who knew people, that the tips that they were coming in online. And there was an overwhelming number of tips they had to deal with. I do not envy them for having to sort through 200,000 plus tips that they received about January 6th. That's overwhelming. I mean, there are just cases probably sitting there today that they have never gotten around to, and it'll probably only be when the sleuths sort of give them a little bit of a kick in the pants on something or say, hey, we found this person doing something, that they'll go back and follow up on some of those tips or use those tips in some way. But it took a while for this trust to sort of build up, I think, between the sleuths and the FBI. And I think that the sleuths have learned a lot about the FBI and sort of been shocked by how far behind they are and just to what was happening online, or making sure that it's brought to their attention. Because you just don't have people who are going out and like, oh, yeah, let me search this hashtag, see what's out there on the internet. It's more of like a closed off system that they're sort of dealing with. And that's not that great when you consider they're only dealing with this very limited knowledge. If I were building one of these cases, it would be very tough for me to find all of this evidence and sort of compile it together in the way that the sleuths had if I was just going off of a tip, and I can only do this on my own. And I think the collaboration has really been one of the sleuths' secret weapons here, is just being able to talk very freely, openly, and in these sort of chat forums very quickly.
With each other.
That hive mind and that crowdsourcing is so beneficial. That's when I have some of my best story ideas, is when you're just talking with someone and then someone adds, and you add, and then you're like, oh, this is a story. And that's what they really thrive on, I think, is this community that they formed. And with the FBI, it's just a whole different structure. They have these field offices and these fiefdoms, really, where they're all these different interests, but you can't really have an open and honest conversation or a free conversation with them because all this is being documented forever. So unless you dial them up on the phone, and that's not really how this collaboration works. And I think about doing this via email, and it seems just like, it seems like such a chore. It really seems mind-sucking. Whereas if you're dealing with one of these chat platforms and sort of a more constant communication is just a really big element of this. And I think that that's what the sleuths have gotten to know over these years.
2.5 years in, it's hard for the sedition hunters themselves to measure their success. Sleuths do not know exactly how many arrests have helped facilitate. They just know they've been in touch with the FBI about hundreds of cases. There are 2 more years for the feds to continue to arrest rioters. So these online investigators, they're still on the case. Do you think the sleuths will ever come forward and claim public credit with their full names? Do you think in 20 years, one of these folks will be sitting around with their grandkids like, Sonny, I did that, you know?
It depends, really, frankly, where things go. I mean, if we're in a second Trump administration, I think there's going to be a lot of very worried sleuths. Obviously, these cases are probably just all going to go away instantly. But, if we get through 2024 and there's relative calm and maybe we get past the statute of limitations and these cases have sort of all gone away, I could see some of them maybe be willing to be more public facing. But I think this is more of a thing that they'll be able to point to and tell people about. But I don't know if they're going to be wanting to be that publicly out there. It really depends on the threat environment, because obviously there's a huge interest in identifying a lot of the people who are working behind the scenes here, and they've been a major target for people on the right. So I think that there's a lot of concerns just like safety wise and what that means for the rest of your life to have that associated with you on the internet.
Ryan, I am super grateful for your time and your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Ryan Reilly is a justice reporter at NBC News, and he's the author of Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System. And that's the show. If you're a fan of what we're doing here at What Next, the best way to support our work is to join Slate Plus. Go on over to slate.com/whatnextplus to sign up. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Paige Osborne, and Madeline Ducharme. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little help from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I will catch you back here next time.
Maybe you've heard that there's a civil war coming.
Tyrants disarm the people they intend to oppress.
That with more than 100 gun deaths a day in America, the powers that be are going to have to do something.
They don't like the Second Amendment. They want to get rid of the Second Amendment.
You've heard that the government has always hated an armed populace.
All they want to do is take guns away from law-abiding citizens.
But in my 8 years of gun reporting, the game is rigged. My name is Alon Stevens, and I'm an investigative reporter. What if I told you that when it comes to the U.S. government, we're the biggest gun dealers on the block? That the halls of American power know exactly what I know. That guns aren't just who we are. They're what we do best.
Guns are flying off the shelves. Ghost gun mill in Dorchester.
Drop the gun! Drop the gun!
This is The Gun Machine, how America is forged by the gun industry. A new podcast from WBUR and The Trace. Search and follow The Gun Machine in your podcast app.